Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Victoria Sancho Lobis, and I'm the Sarah Rumpel and Herbert S. Rumpel Class of 23 Director of the Benton Museum of Art at Pomona College. I'm especially pleased to mark the end of this academic year with tonight's program, and I want to extend a special word of appreciation for the moderator of tonight's conversation, Miranda Roberts, who has been working with us here at the museum over the course of this past year as a consultant for Native American art. I hope tonight's program will indicate how we wish to continue our collaboration with her and with, I hope, many more Indigenous partners. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the Benton Museum of Art at Pomona College and the Humanities Studio in Claremont occupy unceded Indigenous land. We recognize the Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar, the Tongva world. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work with and for the Indigenous peoples of this region and those whose ancestors and relations are represented in our collections, which reflect the creative expression of over 100 Native American tribes. We express gratitude for all those who have cared for the land we call home, and we pay respect to ancestors, elders, and relations, past, present, and emerging. We welcome continued collaboration and guidance as we work to realize the spirit of these words more deeply and more completely. And now I would like to invite Desireé Reneé Martinez, Tongva member, to share some further words to introduce tonight's program.
Thank you, Victoria. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the passing of two of our Tongva elders, Barbara Drake and Julia Bogany. Both over the years have worked tirelessly with students and faculty and staff at the various Claremont colleges to teach about our Tongva history and ancestors. And I personally am very deeply indebted to both of them for the knowledge that they passed on to me, and their passing leaves a large hole in their heart. And I hope that the information that I share with you today is just an example of the work that and the knowledge that they passed on to me. Thanks.
I'm Kevin Detmar, the director of the Humanities Studio at Pomona College. And on behalf of the Humanities Studio, I'd like to thank our partners at the Benton Museum, including Justine Bay-Bias, Claire Nettleton, and Director Victoria Sancho Lobis, who is one of this year's faculty fellows at the studio, for their invitation to collaborate on today's program. In the year now ending, we focused our programming on the topic of indigeneities, hosting programs of poetry with Joy Harjo, fiction with Tommy Orange, history, environmental analysis, and popular music studies, as well as Indigenous studies, including a wonderful presentation and seminar visit with Julia Bogany. Today's conversation about the cultural care of Native artifacts makes a perfect conclusion to our year's programming, and we look forward to many more rich collaborations with the Benton in the future. I'll turn things over now to my colleague Claire Nettleton, academic curator at the Benton Museum.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you, Victoria and Desireé, as well, for your welcome and acknowledgements. I'd also like to thank the Humanities Studio and everyone at the Benton for your co-sponsorship. We would like to thank Gretchen, Rohilden, Justine, of course, Bay-Bias, Crystal, Camarina, and especially our speakers tonight. And thank you all for joining us today. Would everyone please say hello in the chat, and please turn on live transcript for closed captioning. Tonight's program, Cultural Care in Practice, Examples from Tongva and Pueblo of Pojoaque Cultures, will be one of many conversations in conjunction with the Benton Museum of Art's Native American collection. The Benton has taken steps to comply with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which our speakers will discuss more in detail. Beyond the regulations of NAGPRA, we ask, what does it mean to care for these works, and what access should be granted? The speakers will give specific examples from the Tongva and Pueblo of Pojoaque cultures, which highlight practices of cultural care in these particular communities. We are profoundly grateful for their participation and seek to learn from them. We are honored to present our guest this evening. Tonight's program will be moderated by Dr. Meranda Roberts, Northern Paiute in Xicanx, a consultant for the Benton Museum of Art and a researcher curator at the Field Museum of Natural History. Meranda received her PhD at the University of California, Riverside in Native American Studies. Her doctoral work focused on how several Native women basket weavers have used basketry to express their sovereignty. Meranda will be engaging in a conversation with Desireé Reneé Martinez, a Tongva member, and Lynda Romero, a Pueblo of Pojoaque member. Desireé Reneé Martinez is a Tongva tribal archaeologist and the president of Cogstone Resource Management. She has dedicated her life to obtaining skills and knowledge to combat the wanton destruction of Native American sacred and cultural sites, especially those of her community. Ms. Martinez received her BA in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania and her MA in anthropology from Harvard University. She's co-director of the Pimu Catalina Archaeology Project, and her field of work is to remind Southern California community of Tongva's vibrant heritage and continuing contribution to the Southern California region. Lynda Romero is an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Pojoaque. Currently, she's collections manager at the Poeh Cultural Center, where she has worked since 2000. Although she graduated from the Institute of American Indian Arts, most of her experience has been through hands-on work at the Poeh Cultural Center. She recently facilitated a groundbreaking project with the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indian to house 100 historic Tewa pots at the Poeh Cultural Center, and to create a long-term co-stewardship of the Tewa pottery for community access. We will then begin our question answer portion with questions from Dr. Claudia Arteaga, professor of Spanish, Latin American, and Caribbean literatures and cultures from Scripps College, who helped initiate a new minor in Native American and Indigenous Studies, and Hutchinson Fann, Pomona College class of 21, and Humanities Studio Fellow, and our audience. Please submit questions to our panelists in the Q&A, but we encourage you to write in the chat section at any time. It is now my honor to present Dr. Meranda Roberts.
Hello, good evening, everybody. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you for having and holding space for us today. To begin, I would first just like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional homelands of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Potawatomi, Odawa, Ojibwe, as well as the Sac and Fox, the Squawky, Inoka, Ho-Chunk, Miami, as well as Miami and Peoria. And today came out of a talk that the Benton Museum initially asked me to help formulate to bring together people, Indigenous people who could discuss NAGPRA, as was alluded to in the beginning. However, once I was able to bring colleagues on board, it became very clear that to be able to discuss NAGPRA is not going to be just a 1-hour session. It should be a longer type of talk and symposium that is ongoing and always kind of facilitated. And so with that, we decided to shift the narrative into trying to get this discussion to focus on how Indigenous people are expressing their agency within cultural institutions to make sure that their ancestors are honored in a space that has typically, well, not all spaces, but in most spaces that have been typically hard on Indigenous people, and how particular groups like the Poeh Cultural Center are working to bring ancestors home in a way that doesn't necessarily fall under the compliance of NAGPRA, but are long-term loans and that are used for the education of the community. And for us today is for all of you to think about that it doesn't take that much to include Native people in the line of work that you're doing. There are different ways that you can be incorporating and working with us, and also making space for us within your educational systems, within your classes, within your own museums, within your coursework, within your art centers, everywhere. And through these two women's examples, hopefully be able to see that you don't have to follow necessarily these guidelines about how you should do something. There are always ways to be able to make room for us and to be able to honor our ancestors in a way that is respectful of who we are as a people, but also who we want to be as a people. So, and to further that, I also think that this talk is very timely given what has transpired at the University of Penn recently with the unearthing that a human remain, a person who was killed during the MOVE activist bombing in 1985. Their human remains were stored at the Penn Museum, and thinking about how even though Indigenous people's remains and this remains of this person are not on the same level, that history is the same. And you can't really look at that movement and not understand how harmful these spaces have been. So hopefully through discussion today, we'll be able to see how these topics are not separated, that they are here, that we have to honor them and talk about them. And I hope that we all get to the point where we understand that, as my favorite poet, Audre Lorde, said, that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And so hopefully that we can bring that into the forefront and have you guys, and have all of you here, really dig deep and understand about what it means to work with Indigenous people as well as other people from different cultural groups. So with that, it is my honor to present and to introduce my friend and colleague, Desireé Martinez, who will be discussing a brief synopsis of NAGPRA, as well as her work with the Autry Museum of the American West. Nice to see you, Desireé.
Thanks. And thanks for the invite. I was excited when Meranda told me about this conversation. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, just so that you can get a handle. But what I'm going to be talking about is what has come out of those initial steps with my work with the Autry Museum of the American West and traditional care. So if you can go to the next slide, please. And so the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was an act that was passed in 1990, and basically it's a human rights law. It was a law that was passed with the support of a number of Congress people as well as the Native American community in order to make sure that our ancestors that were dug up since colonization and are sitting on museum shelves, along with the gifts that were given to them when they were buried, return back to their homelands and to be reburied. A lot of Native communities had seen a lot of our ancestors not only on museum shelves, but also on public display at a lot of different historical monuments. And those types of displays really hurt the community, and a lot of it was done with the backing of the United States government, in that after a lot of the wars that occurred on the plains, for instance, particular soldiers were told to pick up the remains of various leaders and then send them off to the National Museum, which eventually became the Smithsonian. And so because we have those ancestors that are on those shelves, and in some instances we know their names, we wanted those ancestors back into the ground. And so although the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act has been passed 30 years out, we are still having our ancestors on the shelves. So there's still a lot of work to do. And in how NAGPRA is implemented at various institutions is different. And for my community, the Gabrielino Tongva, because we're not federally recognized, meaning that the government does not acknowledge an official relationship with our community, our ability to claim our ancestors are pretty limited under NAGPRA. And I don't want to go into those details, but one of the reasons why we have been so slow to make claims to the various institutions that hold our ancestors, both within California and across the United States, is because of our lack of federal recognition. Because NAGPRA is a federal law, it applies to federally recognized tribes. Can I get the next slide? But one of the things that we have done as a community, particularly here in the Los Angeles area, which is our original homelands, is try to work with public institutions to teach about our traditions and our culture from our point of view. A lot of times we've seen within the both the academic and the archaeological literature that the way that we're presented sometimes is counter to what our traditional beliefs are, in that we emerged from this land from time and we've lived here from time immemorial. And so in working with these institutions in order to update their exhibits and their education documents that they provide to the public, we also start talking about NAGPRA and how we can get our ancestors home. Unfortunately, or fortunately, NAGPRA does take a lot of time to implement, in that it, particularly for those institutions that have not been able to track the items that they have in their collections. It's taken a little while for various institutions to get up to date, particularly with the advances in technology. And when we start talking with various institutions, we're always asking, are you sure that this is all of the information that you have about our ancestors and about their items? And so one of the first institutions that we started to talk to regarding repatriation of our ancestors was the Southwest Museum. The Southwest Museum was one of the oldest museums here in California with one of the largest collections. In the early 2000s, they were bought by the Autry, and they took over control of those collections. And in those discussions of talking about how we can start to get those ancestors back, and again, because we're not federally recognized, one of the hindrances for us to actually start making those claims is that we have no place to rebury. And so we kind of put off those initial talks. But one of the big things about making sure that our ancestors are respected and treated correctly is, okay, we know that they're in this institution. How can we make sure that our ancestors, that the appropriate people are looking at our ancestors, they're being culturally sensitive in terms of that handling, and what type of protocols can we help the museum create in order to make sure that our concerns are being taken care of. And so in 2012, the Southwest Museum, the Autry was moving the Southwest Museum collections to a new facility in Burbank that was going to be, is state of the art. And one of the things in discussion with both the NAGPRA coordinator as well as the curators is what cultural protocols should be put in place regarding the objects as they're being transferred. And of course, this move was going to be multi-year. And one of the things that the Autry did was hire me as a consultant because a majority of the objects, NAGPRA eligible objects, were from the Gabrielino Tongva community. And so I had done a lot of work with UCLA back in 2006, where UCLA moved its collections from one building to another. And I was able to create a process in which the Native people whose ancestors were being held by UCLA at the time, which included both California and outside of California individuals, to participate if they wanted to within the move. And so I wanted to replicate that at the Autry, and I actually did. Next slide. And so one of the big things that was great about the move was that when the Autry secured the building, the Gabrielino Tongva community was actually brought in at the very forefront of that building before they even started to build and assign spaces. They brought us in to take a tour, and we actually looked at all the construction plans, and we created a Gabrielino Tongva community, I don't want to say advisory board, but a community working group where we gave our input in terms of where we wanted the ancestors to be placed, what other types of spaces would be needed. There is a garden that was put into this into the space. There was a repatriation room where that was connected to the garden, so that if for some reason ceremonies that need to be done outside as opposed into a room, things could get moved. So from the very beginning, in terms of looking at that building, we were able to give our input and state, you know, here's the various things that come to mind. If our ancestors need to stay here for a little while longer until we can get them into the ground, here's how we want them to be treated. Here's what we think is going to be appropriate for their care. And like I said, they actually took our comments to heart. In one instance, there was a smaller room that they had thought that the ancestors would fit in, but for us, we wanted to have a larger space so that we could actually, if need be, conduct ceremony and have altars, ceremonial altars there, and they were able to accommodate that. The other big thing as well that we were able to do and is send out letters to those tribes that could be possibly affiliated with all of the collections that were there at the Autry, and ask them what were the cultural protocols from their community that needed to be put in place with the move of their ancestors and their gifts. And at that time, because the Autry and the Southwest Museum are on Tongva land, within that letter, we specifically stated that the Gabrielino Tongva community were going to be, we didn't want to say we appointed ourselves, but if they could not participate themselves, that we would be witnesses, that we would be present when the ancestors and the items would be moved to make sure that they were taken care of properly. Next slide. And so part of that traditional care and taking making sure that the ancestors and their items were taken care of properly was creating or doing a ceremony within both at the Southwest Museum to prepare the ancestors and the items for their journey, but also to prepare the space in which they were going to go into. And that included leaving offerings, gifts to make sure that the ancestors knew that they were loved. And one of the big things, it's really a horrible experience to be in a room when your ancestors are in boxes and on shelves. It's emotional, and particularly for those ancestors, you could feel their loneliness. You could feel that they were forgotten. And so one of the things that we wanted to make sure is the ancestors knew that we didn't forget them. We know they're there. We came to visit, and that we're doing everything as a community possible in order to get them back into the ground. And so that was one of the things that, one of the reasons why we wanted to not only prepare them for their journey, but then also make sure that the space that they're going to enter in was filled with our love and our care, and knowing that we were going to do everything possible to get them back into the ground. And so this picture shows some of the offerings that we had because of curation standards and making sure that no bugs and other types of things would get in and contaminate the collections. We'd rather have our offerings, which were had medicine and things like that, out in the open so that they could breathe the air along with the ancestors. We decided to agree to have them in glass jars so that there wouldn't be any of that contamination and worry about bugs and things like that, to make sure that the curatorial standards were up. And so we were able to do that and leave them in a whole bunch of different spaces, both in the various shelves, but then also on altars. So if you can go to the next slide. So one of the things that we did was that we left offerings in all of the different rooms that would have not only Tongva ancestors and their items, but also other Native American items as well. And then within the hallway, we actually put an altar. And so one of the things within our community is that we have altars with various gifts and offerings to again, be there to acknowledge that we're there and that it's a sacred space. And we created the altar so that if other Native American communities came to visit the new space, they would be able to leave their own offerings as well. And so there was, we placed an altar in the long hallway, and we also placed an altar within the ancestor storage area, which includes, again, not only just Gabrielino Tongva ancestors, but other ancestors from other communities as well. And one of the big things that happened at the move, during the move as well, particularly with the ancestors and their items, is that from start to finish, a community member representative was there watching. And so in fact that we followed the truck on the freeway from the Autry campus in Los Angeles to the new research space in Burbank. And this was all something that was accommodated by the Autry staff. And one of the big things as well, particularly when you're caring for ancestors and moving ancestors, is that our community, women are not to be touching ancestors because they can affect us more than other community members. So we had some male members help with the move in that actually doing, because all of the things were ancestors and their items were put on carts, but then actually being able to help with moving those carts if they wanted to. And so, you know, being there, being witness, so many things have been done to our ancestors and to the items without our knowledge. And so working with the Autry, particularly with the move, was the beginning of a relationship where the staff understood why it was very important in order for us to witness this move, but also to make sure that that we were able to leave gifts, and of course we can visit our ancestors and their items at any time. And it's one of those things where we're going to be continuing that dialogue, and as a result of this, we have now signed a memorandum of understanding with the Autry that lists the various relationships, describes the relationship that the Gabrielino Tongva community now has with the Autry, and identifies a number of different goals that we have together in order to kind of forward some of the projects that the Gabrielino community wants to go forward with. For instance, updating their education and exhibits, but then also, of course, working to get our ancestors home. So although, you know, our ancestors aren't back yet, we know that they are being well cared for in this new facility until they can come back to us.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Desireé, so much. I remain in awe of you, Desireé, and every work that you do, you and Lilium and everyone at the Autry. This is amazing. So thank you for sharing with us. Now it is my pleasure to welcome new friend and colleague, Lynda Romero, who is at the Poeh Cultural Center at the Pueblo of Pojoaque, who is going to discuss the work that her community has done specifically to work with the National Museum of the American Indian to bring back a series of pots and what that relationship looks like. And thank you, Lynda, for being here.
Thank you, Miranda. Umbiagindi, Sengitei. Good afternoon. My name is Lynda Romero. If you can start the slideshow. Thank you. I am an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Pojoaque. We are one of 6 Tewa-speaking tribes located in New Mexico. Our Tewa name, Posuwage Owinge, translates to water drinking place. Next slide. Currently, I'm the collections manager at the Poeh Cultural Center. At the Poeh, we strive to promote cultural preservation through curation, exhibition, and interactions with all Pueblos. Next slide, please. We are a resource for Pueblo art and culture with a primary focus on the 6 Tewa-speaking tribes of New Mexico. Next slide. Our collections includes contemporary historical and archaeological works, which are invaluable resources to artists and researchers from within and outside of the Pueblo community. Next slide. When I began working at the Poeh Cultural Center, it wasn't because I had a degree in museum studies. It was because I was a tribal member, and this was a cultural center, located within our tribe. Next slide. I got a crash course in the many aspects of museum work. I am more of a hands-on learner, so this was a great opportunity for me to learn this new and have a new cultural relationship with my with the objects that we had in the collections. Excuse me, sorry, next slide. The Poeh Museum, as we were known then, was striving to meet a high museum standard. And that meant that Western museum practices guided our policies and procedures and collections care. Next slide. Fast forward to 2006, when we began, sorry, my son's laughing in the other room, sorry about that. Let's fast forward to 2006, when we began the process of a long-term community loan with the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. Next slide. The purpose of this community loan was to select 100 Tewa Pueblo pots from their collection to bring home and back into the Tewa community. And as Desireé said, this was a very emotional process for us. How do we select only a certain number of pots to bring back to our community and leave the rest behind? The selection was based on different criteria. Some pots we could not bring back because they weren't stable to travel. So there was many trips that we took to the collections room at NMAI. Next slide. So we began the process by visiting their collections just to get an idea of the different type of pottery that they had. We looked at the 6 Tewa tribes and just looked at the various vessels that they had in their collection. Next slide. We then formed an advisory board of Tewa Pueblo elders, cultural leaders, and artists to begin the selection of the pots. Next slide. We wanted to include the Tewa Pueblo community to be sure the pots that came home were appropriate to be on exhibit. We had conversations about depictions, designs, shapes of vessels and usage, and just making sure that anything we brought back wasn't anything that was ceremonial or from a society that shouldn't be on public display. Next slide. We received the pots in 2 phases. It was a long process. It took about 3 years. It was a huge learning experience for all of us. In the first phase, we received 9 pots, and they were driven across the country from Sweetland, Maryland to Pojoaque to our cultural center. And this was our first exhibit case that we had for them. Next slide. During the process of the loan, between the Poeh and NMAI, we were able to create a unique working relationship. They did a lot of training. They had our staff come in and we did a mount making workshop. So we learned how to make metal mounts for the pots that were going to be installed. It was all, we were involved through the whole process in just different things. We had to work on exhibit design. We made these mounts. We were also involved in the installation of all the pots once that time came. Next slide, please. So we had to recreate our gallery space to create an exhibit space for the pots that were going to be coming home. This was part of our agreement with NMAI. And so we have about 3 gallery spaces, and we completely recreated one of them to house these pots, and we can have a place to store them. Next slide. Okay, so as the second phase approached, we received the rest of the pots and we started to install them, and we worked with NMAI staff the entire time. We were able to install the mounts that we had made. We we were able to install the mounts that we made. We were able to install the pots. NMAI staff trained us so that we had the proper handling techniques to be able to care for these objects, to be able to care for the pots. Next slide. And so we worked on this to make sure that we had that the pots were on display and the casework was made according to NMAI standards. We needed to make sure that they were spaced evenly, that there was enough room for the pots. there was just a lot of conversation that went into this. To really kind of sum this up, this 3-year project was, it would take a lot longer than the time I have. So it was a long process. It was a healing process for us too. You know, it gave us a chance to see vessels that we maybe have not seen in our community for a long time. We were able to have a relationship with these vessels. You know, we were able to bring these back and have them in the communities from where they had originated. Next slide. And so in these selections with, and in this agreement with NMAI, we made a selection of 24 handling pots. And so this means that these pots are stable, they're able to be held. And so Tewa community members can come into our Poeh Cultural Center and they can request to do research, and we will open up the cases, take out the pots. And so part of our design was making sure that these pots were placed in a way that was easy to access them. So if you see on this slide in the bottom middle, those two, the pitcher and the bowl, are both part of our handling selection. So those are pots that our community can come and request and look at. So we have about 24 of those that we have available. And next slide. So part of this project, I think was very healing for many of us, for our community members. It was very healing for me. As I mentioned, we had, when I began working at the Poeh, we were trying to just be part of this high museum standard. We wanted to be taken seriously, you know, and so we had to practice very like Western museum methods. We used gloves. We were very disconnected from our collections. And I didn't realize how much it had affected me until I started going on these trips to NMAI and going and having conversations with community elders and community leaders and having a better understanding of what I was missing, or a better understanding of my culture, or a better understanding of pottery. And luckily, because the Poeh Cultural Center is located within Pojoaque, and we are able to make the rules and, you know, make things the way we want them, we have decided to start to incorporate more cultural practice in our collections care and in our museum practices. We are trying to be more aware that certain vessels do need to be touched. And so as long as you have clean hands, you don't need to wear gloves. You know, there's certain things that do require a certain kind of care. Certain things shouldn't be near each other. Certain objects should be covered. Certain objects are not for the public. And so we try to incorporate all these different methods and ideas into our collections now. And so I had the job of revising our policies and procedures to include a more cultural take on them. And that has been a project that I was able to work on. And so we are now trying to move away from the Western practices. And our relationship with the National Museum of the American Indian was really great for us, because we were able to learn from them, and they were able to learn from us. And we were both able to walk away with new knowledge of our museum work and what we do. I feel that this was also healing for me in a way that I got to handle so many of these vessels when we were at the collections of NMAI. And on one of the occasions, I was rubbing my hand along the rim of the pot, and I could feel fingerprint indentations. And so just feeling those and knowing that a community member from the past had made that pot, and I was able to like feel their fingertips and feel where they had worked, and feel their essence. It is essentially, I guess, you know, it felt good to me. It felt good to me to bring these pots back, and it helped me to develop a better relationship with our collections. It helped me to realize and to know that these are our extended community members, and they all have their own lifeline, and they should be treated as such. they shouldn't be treated as something that is separate from us. We should very well incorporate them into our daily life. And so, you know, even walking into the collections every morning, I try to greet all of our objects. I try to greet all of everything that we have. I try to maintain a working relationship with them so that I know if I'm doing the right thing or if I'm not doing the wrong thing, that I know that they will let me know. And so I think having this relationship and being able to know that as a Tewa Pueblo person, that I have the knowledge to take care of my own cultural objects, to take care of my own cultural property, without having to be told how things should be done. You know, I have a new ownership of my culture and of just my job and my work. You know, it makes me happy to be involved in this. And thank you.
Thank you, Lynda. I was tearing up for a second. And before we go into the Q&A section really quick, I just hope that from these two presentations, which are much more of an extensive talk, that listeners can understand then that these items that we are referring to are much more than just an item for people to study and to look at. We consider them to be alive in many different ways. And it is well, I will speak for myself, my responsibility to help sing their songs when I can. And so I hope that we can take that and move forward in thinking about that movement in our daily lives. So now I'm going to go ahead and ask our first question, which comes from, or ask our first question, which, wait, am I asking? Our first question comes from Professor Claudia Arteaga, sorry.
Thank you so much, Miranda. Thank you so much, our panelists. There have been brilliant, wonderful presentations. And I just wanted to touch upon some of the topics that you have already presented in terms of curating and all these healing and cultural practices that are required, that you think are appropriate in order, before even to put objects in display. And I was thinking that when we go to a museum and when we see an exhibition, we see what is already in display. And we don't wonder sometimes, or most of the time, about the process that was behind that, right? We don't wonder about all these healing processes, or all these debates and conversation that took place before even to have these objects visible for us. So I was wondering, what do you think could be in terms of curating, in terms of putting these objects in exhibition? What do you think could be an appropriate practice that could also honor the objects, but also the all these processes that were behind, or that are also involved into this curation, right? I'm thinking about in terms of what Lynda discuss in these non-Westernized methods, right, that are part of these conversations around the objects and all these cultural meanings that the objects have. How, as Westernized viewers, a Westernized public can also get a sense, or can also approach to this knowledge that are put into curating these objects. And yeah, I was wondering about that, since and how we in the setting of a museum, how students, non-Indigenous students that we have also in the Claremont colleges, how they can approach to these objects by acknowledging all this cultural practice without falling into appropriation, which is also a common way of grasping westernized knowledges. So yeah, that will be my question for you.
You want to go first, Lynda?
Why don't you go ahead?
I've actually had a lot of conversations about this with a number of different institutions, and changing the way that Tongva objects are presented to the public. And just exactly what Miranda said and exactly what Lynda said, I have the same feeling when I'm touching objects. And they're I don't want to say they're mine, but they're my ancestors. There's something about, particularly as an archaeologist, I sometimes dig up things that haven't been seen for, you know, thousands of years, quite literally. And I'm the next person to have seen these and touched these. And there's that connection. And they want to be touched. They want to be part of the community again. Well, if they're from burials, they shouldn't be part of the community. But for other things that you find, they need to come back, not only to the Tongva community, but for people to understand, they need to come back to the public as well. And so I'm always one for touchy-feely things. You know, thinking about our manos and metates, which are the metates being slabs in which we're using as grinding stones in order to grind our acorns and other plant materials and seeds, so that we can eat. You know, that process, one of the things that I do or used to do, we ran an archaeological field school out on Catalina, Pimu, which is what it's called in Tongva. We would, for, you know, over 8 years, we would teach archaeological students about archaeology, but within a Tongva perspective. And one of them was having a native foods workshop where I actually made the kids make stone tools and then use the stone tools to process the food. So using scrapers and, you know, cutting instruments to cut the deer for the stew, and then actually using rocks to grind the acorns, so that they can understand how they were put into use. But it also brings life to those objects again. And they become useful to the community. So I'm always about, and this is particularly when you're talking to art museums, they hate this idea that you're going to be touching these things that are, you know, that are one of a kind. But there's a whole bunch of other objects that we have thousands of, like manos and metates. There's thousands, there's probably millions of them all over. And, you know, picking one out and being able to have people to use those to process. And of course, you know, there's all these health issues in terms of seeds and nuts and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, bringing them back into usages is always great. The Autry actually has what they have these hands-on carts, and one of them is actually for Tongva, where we have replica artifacts. So that when they either, you know, take them into the classroom or have classes come in, the kids are able to touch various objects that have been made by our elders and other community educators. And so, you know, they're not real objects, but they're replicas, so that they can, you know, if it's a rattle, they can shake the rattle. If it's, you know, some type of artifact, they can hold it. And there's something about that touch that just I want more of. And unfortunately, it's a really long conversation, particularly with those institutions where, oh my God, you can't touch. I hate the glove thing. You know, I was a curator. I was a curatorial assistant at the Peabody at Harvard. And it's just like, I hated it and I understood it, but it's just like, but I want to touch, because that's part of my communication with my ancestors' things.
I think the question is a perfect example of why collections need to be in communities, you know, because community members know how to take care of collections. And as Desireé mentioned earlier, you know, making sure that the appropriate person is touching certain objects. You know, you want to make sure you have, maybe, you know, maybe it's not appropriate for a woman, maybe, you know, only a certain society member should touch it or see it, you know, so you definitely want to, like, that's important, you know, making sure that these objects are taken care of carefully. But there's also, you know, like Desireé said, and I'm the same way, I love to touch. And the image that was in my last slide was a water jar that was found. There's a family that lives next to our tribal land that used to be tribal land. And so we have a good relationship with them. And when I had begun working at the Poeh, one of the family members was cleaning the ditch, and they called us and they said, we found some water jars in the ditch. And so they were completely intact. But unfortunately, as they were excavated, they started to crumble, but we were able to put them together. And the water jar, I like putting it on my head, you know, like the little, I don't know, like the round bottom, it fits perfect. Like it's not uncomfortable. It feels perfect. And the little grooves, my hands fit in there, like, you know, just the bend of my hand fits in there perfect. And so I know it was for that purpose, you know, and I don't know if I could recreate it, you know, to be so perfect and smooth, but, you know, just the fact that you know, that this object was made this way and it should be touched because that's what it was made for. I mean, I can't put water in it anymore, but, you know, it is just nice to put it on my head and like balance it and feel the, you know, feel what it was meant for. You know, it makes me feel connected to it. You know, we're all in one.
Yes, beautiful. And just really quickly, I will say that in the incorporation of bringing students in, especially in colleges, all of it is nothing can be done without Indigenous intervention of some sort. Indigenous people need to be brought in to help better contextualize these items to the point where they should be paid and where they should be given, or some sort of reciprocity is established, because we're the ones who could tell our stories the best and can be the ones who could tell how to properly distinguish them. Because I think in my head, there's often this idea that our culture is up for grabs since it is in a museum, but that's no longer the case. We need to make more space for us and to tell our stories. And now I'm going to hand it over to our next question, who comes from Hutchinson Fann, who is of Pomona College and going to be graduating this year.
Hey guys, I am very curious about sort of this thread about objects and artifacts being alive and not extinct. And really something I'm thinking about is how even the English language of object or artifact is sort of insufficient here. An object or an artifact feels like something that's separate, that's sort of extinct. And off of that, I'm really curious to ask about the idea of salvage ethnography, the mindset some scholars have had about studying native ways of life as if they were pure forms of life that went extinct at the first sign of any foreign influence. I'm curious to ask about how this mindset in practice has hindered indigenous people from asserting property rights over their community's items and artifacts, and how this might be undone going forward, and what its impact might be going forward, its legacies.
It's interesting that you should bring this up. And one of the things about being a non-federally recognized tribe is that we're always, particularly when we're trying to make claims for our ancestors, is we always have to prove ourselves that we're descendants of the people that are on those shelves. And it had for us, for the Gabrielino Tonga, there's a whole bunch of academic interpretations out there and studies that state that we are extinct, we don't exist, just because exactly what you said is that we didn't live like when we were studied in the late 1800s and the 1900s, the people that were identifying themselves as being Gabrielino Tongva didn't fit the parameters or characteristics of what early ethnographers and anthropologists thought Indians should be, particularly in California, with the community being forced into missions and being forced to speak Spanish and basically being Spanish and Mexican peasants, wearing cloth and stuff like that, and foregoing our cultural traditions, or trying to make us forego our cultural traditions. On the outside, we didn't look Indian enough for them. And so because of that, I've gotten, as well as a lot of other Tongva community members, of like, you guys are just delusional Mexicans. You're not really Indian. And when you start throwing stuff like that and questioning somebody's identity, that then hinders you to go forward and try to make those claims for those ancestors. In some of the archaeological literature, it actually states that the Gabrielino Tongva didn't come into the Los Angeles area until about 4000 BP, that we pushed out whoever was originally here, and that thus, when we go to make claims for ancestors that are older than 4000 BP, that those aren't our ancestors, because based on the archaeological theories that are out there, those aren't our people, which is totally goes against our belief system, like I stated, that we emerged from here. And actually, if you look at the archaeological record, it's, you know, in place evolution, if you want to use the academic terms. We've always been here. Those are our ancestors. But when you have other experts countering everything that you're saying, it makes it really difficult. And it's that early salvage ethnography stuff we're always fighting against.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said, Desireé, about having to prove your Indianness, because, you know, that's something that in our tribe we struggle with as well. You know, our tribe, there were several tribes along, several pueblos along the Rio Grande Valley, and with the Spanish invasion, a lot of us moved to other tribes. Some of us were almost killed off. Our tribe has been abandoned twice, and so you know, it really is hard sometimes to you know, we have other there, you know, it's unfortunate that, you know, as Native American people and as Pueblo people, you know, we have to like prove each other to, you know, prove ourselves to each other, you know, and we shouldn't be doing that. You know, we should have a stronger bond. And so, you know, it's sad that we have to do that within our own communities, but yet do it in the bigger picture, you know. And so that's hurtful to us. You know, we know we were here, you know, even, you know, like, and we know how to take care of things. Even in our collections, you know, well, because I'm I work in a cultural center within my tribe. A lot of our employees are tribal members, and we have a bigger, how would I say, like a bigger, our culture plays a huge part in that. One of our staff members is part of our Kiva men, you know, our religious leaders. So whenever there's, you know, any kind of issues with NAGPRA or anything like that, that usually goes to them first, and they kind of review it. They you know, talk amongst themselves, and they make the decision. And if it's something that they have to handle, you know, human remains, then they handle that, and we don't. But if it's something that maybe is some basketry or something that was, you know, ceremonial use, but it was okay to have in our collections, that, you know, that we're just having back. We have a cabinet in our collections where we put these objects, and it stays locked and it's identified. But, you know, we still need to care for that. You know, we still need to be those caretakers. And as that, we need to make sure that it's appropriate. You know, we need to make sure that the methods that they're being cared for is appropriate. You know, sometimes we receive things back from non-Native community members, and they're sacred objects. You know, they may be shrines or sacred objects that they, you know, found in their yard, and so they picked up because they, you know, thought it was, you know, or they knew what it was, but, you know, they pick it up. And so because we have so many non-Pueblo living on our land that is no longer our land, you know, there's so many sacred stuff that gets lost, or, you know, just into the wrong hands, I guess. And so, you know, it's important that we make sure that these are taken care of. So if you know, somehow somebody returns a shrine to us, you know, we make sure that it's put back in an appropriate place. And you know, it goes back to taking care of the way that we would take care of it, the way we have always taken care of it.
Yes. Thank you so much, Lynda. And for my 2 cents, I work in a place that was literally built on the idea that all Native people from across the world would die off, and that they would have to be the ones to tell our stories. And so working in an environment like that, where you're supposed to not even be there in the first place, is not only hurtful, but it's also a big responsibility. You have a lot of things. I have a lot that I carry on my shoulders because I don't have all the answers. And so the idea that I see these items as ancestors, even if I'm not from Pojoaque or I'm not Tongva or any other of these communities, is to honor and respect them to the best of my ability to when I enter a museum space. And so I hope that today, as we're wrapping up, thank you for everyone who has joined us, that the more that you've heard from us, and I know that there's probably a lot more questions that will want to be asked, that you register or you send an email to the Benton Museum so that we could try to make more room for more conversations to continue, as well as if you would like to get in touch with us panelists, they can filter the messages back to us. And I just want to say thank you, and I hope that we gave you all something to think about, to take with you in working with Indigenous groups and working, as always, on Indigenous land. So thank you all again, and we hope that you have a great night.